You begin with a simple assumption. If you understand enough, you will be calm. If you can explain what is happening, you will be settled. But that assumption hides something. It treats knowledge as if it automatically produces truth, and truth as if it automatically produces peace. Al-Ghazali would not allow you to keep that sequence without examination. He observed that the mind often calls something true when it is only familiar, and calls something certain when it is only repeated. So the question is not, what do you know? The question is, how do you know that you know? If your certainty is built inside the same mind that wants comfort, can certainty ever be clean? And if certainty is not clean, what exactly are you chasing when you chase peace? Al-Ghazali lived in an intellectual environment that treated argument as a high craft. In Baghdad and the wider scholarly world, there were jurists refining law, theologians refining doctrine, philosophers refining logic, and spiritual teachers refining inner discipline. Each group had methods, each group had proofs, and each group claimed a form of certainty. This matters because it shows that confusion is not always caused by ignorance. Sometimes it is produced by abundance, too many frameworks, too many reasons, too many final answers offered too quickly. Al-Ghazali's originality was not that he lacked options. It was that he questioned the reliability of the instrument choosing between them. Al-Ghazali's crisis can be understood without biography. It is a structural problem. The mind tries to prove reality using tools that depend on the mind. You can build an argument, but the argument still appears inside awareness. You can verify a conclusion, but verification still happens as a mental event. If the mind doubts its own capacity to judge, every proof becomes unstable, not because the proof is weak, but because the judge is uncertain. You begin to see the same issue in your own life. You can reason your way into a plan and still feel unsettled. You can resolve one question and immediately generate another. Not because you are irrational, but because the mind is trying to become certain about itself using itself. If the knower is the uncertain element, what proof can remove uncertainty without first assuming what it tries to prove? Al-Ghazali did not discard reason. He placed it. Reason can clarify definitions, expose contradictions, and test coherence. It can protect you from obvious error. But reason cannot grant the one thing the mind most secretly wants when it chases peace: total closure. Reason works by steps, and every step depends on premises. Even when premises are strong, they remain premises. The mind tries to turn a tool into a throne. It wants reason to become an absolute source rather than a disciplined method. You can watch this inside yourself. When you are unsettled, you do not merely think, you demand that thinking end the unsettledness. You treat the next conclusion as if it will terminate uncertainty permanently. But reason does not terminate, it organizes. So the question becomes sharper. If reason is a map, why do you keep expecting it to become the place you want to arrive at? Now the pattern becomes visible. You notice that the mind promises peace after the next conclusion. It says, "Once I understand this, I will relax." Then it moves the finish line. The next task appears, the next question appears, the next improvement appears. The chase does not end because the mind is not only solving problems. It is maintaining an identity that needs to feel secure. Al-Ghazali's method begins here. He treats the mind not only as a knower, but as a being with motives. The mind wants coherence. The mind wants control. The mind wants protection from being wrong. These motives do not announce themselves as motives. They announce themselves as search for truth. You begin to see that the peace chase can be sincere and still be distorted. It can want truth, but want it in a particular form: immediate, complete, and comforting. Third-person clarity helps. Al-Ghazali observed that when the instrument of knowing is also the instrument of self-protection, It will unconsciously shape what counts as enough. Second-person introspection completes it. You can feel that hunger for enough inside your own thinking. It is not a desire to understand. It is a desire to stop feeling exposed to uncertainty. So the central puzzle becomes precise. If the mind is the one seeking peace, can it also be the one that stops seeking without losing its sense of control? Your definition of peace determines your strategy. If peace means no disturbance, you will treat disturbance as an enemy. If peace means certainty, you will treat doubt as a defect. If peace means control, you will treat unpredictability as a threat. None of these definitions are neutral. Each one builds a method, and each method produces a certain kind of inner life. You may call peace the moment when questions stop. But when questions stop, why do they stop? Do they stop because truth has been reached, or because inquiry has been interrupted? You may call peace the moment life feels manageable. But manageability is not the same as reality. It is a relationship to reality shaped by your capacity and your preferences. You may call peace the absence of contradiction, but contradiction is often the mind's signal that its framework is incomplete. Al-Ghazali's approach is not to shame definitions, but to expose what they do. A definition of peace as absence trains the mind to filter experience. It seeks a world that does not trigger inquiry. It selects beliefs that remove friction. It repeats conclusions that create a feeling of stability. Then it calls that stability truth. You begin to realize something uncomfortable but clean. Sometimes you want peace more than you want clarity. Yet you call that desire clarity to keep it respectable. So ask the question plainly: if peace is defined as no disturbance, does that mean truth must be filtered until it no longer disturbs you? Al-Ghazali's diagnostic move is simple but demanding. Examine the reliability of the knowing faculty itself, not only the objects it claims to know. Most people aim their scrutiny outward. They scrutinize theories, events, other people, and outcomes. Al-Ghazali turns scrutiny inward, toward the mechanism producing certainty. He would ask, is the mind's confidence earned or inherited? Is it the result of direct understanding or social repetition? Is it supported by careful distinction or by habit? And more subtly, what does the mind protect when it insists that a conclusion must be final? You can apply this without drama. When you feel unsettled, you often look for an answer that ends the unsettledness. That answer might be true, but your selection of it is influenced by a hidden requirement. It must soothe. So the tool of reasoning becomes a trap, not because reasoning is false, but because it is being used for a second purpose alongside truth: self-stabilization. Al-Ghazali does not say, stop thinking. He says, stop being unconscious about why you think. Do you use knowledge as a light that reveals, or as shelter that conceals? The same sentence can be either, depending on the role it plays in your inner economy. This is where the mind becomes difficult to judge. It can produce arguments for what it needs, and call them objective. So the paradox appears. If reason is the judge of reasons, by what standard does it judge itself without circularity? You begin to observe a subtle mechanism. Some conclusions feel settling not because they are accurate, but because they reduce inquiry. The mind learns the difference between understanding and closure, but it prefers closure when it is tired. Certainty becomes a sedative when its function is not to clarify reality, but to quiet the need to face it. You can watch the sequence. A question arises. Uncertainty appears. The mind experiences uncertainty as exposure. It then reaches for a belief that dissolves exposure. If the belief works, the mind feels relief. Then it labels the belief true, because it confuses relief with verification. Al-Ghazali's lens exposes the moral neutrality of the mechanism and the danger of its invisibility. The mind is not evil for wanting rest. But when rest becomes the standard of truth, truth is distorted. The mind then becomes skilled at building calmness through belief rather than building accuracy through inquiry. Notice how this changes your inner posture. You stop asking, "Is this coherent?" and start asking without admitting it, "Does this quiet me?" The question is hidden, but its influence is decisive. A disciplined mind can still choose certainty at times. Life requires decisions. But the difference is whether you know why you are choosing it, and whether you confuse that choice with finality. So the test is direct. If a belief calms you, how do you know whether it is true or merely effective at ending questions? The mind often tries to buy peace through management. It reduces life into what can be handled: plans, systems, predictions, and guarantees. This is not entirely wrong. Management can reduce chaos. But when management becomes the meaning of peace, you become dependent on conditions you do not control. Al-Ghazali's inquiry separates two things that the mind blends: understanding and controlling. You can understand a situation and still not control it. You can control a small part of a situation and still not understand it. Yet the mind often treats control as evidence of understanding and lack of control as evidence of confusion. Second-person observation makes it practical. When you plan extensively, you may be doing more than preparing. You may be seeking to remove the possibility of surprise. You may be seeking a world where nothing tests your certainty. But reality does not become smaller because you map it. Third-person clarity sharpens the point. Al-Ghazali suggests that when the mind cannot accept uncertainty, it turns thinking into control. It becomes less a search for truth and more a defense against unpredictability. Then it calls that defense wisdom. You begin to see that the need to manage can become endless. It creates more variables, more branches, more contingency plans. It gives the mind more work, not less. So ask, if peace depends on control, is it peace at all, or merely a temporary agreement with uncertainty? Doubt is usually treated as a flaw. But doubt can be a discipline. Al-Ghazali's crisis shows a form of doubt that is not cynical. It is precise. It is the refusal to claim certainty where certainty has not been earned. In third-person terms, doubt performs a purification function. It breaks the automatic trust you place in your inherited assumptions. It forces you to distinguish between what you repeated and what you directly understand. It exposes where the mind used confidence as a substitute for clarity. In second-person terms, you notice that your mind fears doubt because doubt interrupts stability. But stability is not the same as truth. If your stability depends on not asking certain questions, then your stability is fragile by design. Doubt threatens that fragility, and your mind interprets the threat as danger. So the work becomes subtle. You do not chase doubt to feel sophisticated. You use doubt to test the cleanliness of your knowing. Where does your certainty come from? How quickly does it appear? How angry does it become when challenged? These are signs, not of truth, but of attachment. Doubt, properly used, does not destroy your life. It destroys false confidence. It makes space for a steadier kind of understanding, one that does not panic when incomplete. So the paradox remains. If doubt is a doorway to honesty, why does the mind experience it as danger? Here is what most people never notice. The mind can become skilled at explanation while remaining unchanged. You can solve many questions and still be the same person who needs them solved. You can describe the path clearly and still feel dependent on descriptions. Al-Ghazali quietly separates two kinds of knowing. One kind gathers information. It can win debates. It can produce clarity on paper. The other kind reforms the knower. It changes perception, not merely vocabulary. The first kind is easy to measure. The second kind is harder because it is internal. It shows itself as reduced distortion, reduced self-deception, reduced need for reassurance. Second-person introspection reveals the substitution. When you are unsettled, you may look for a new idea. The idea gives you structure, and structure feels like peace. But soon you need another idea. Then another. You call this learning, but it is sometimes only a cycle of stabilization through novelty. Third-person exposition shows why this happens. The mind prefers what it can hold. Explanations can be held. Transformation cannot be held, it must be lived. So the mind unconsciously chooses the kind of knowing that keeps it in control, the kind that becomes a possession. But peace, in Ghazali's direction, is not a conclusion you own. It is what remains when the need to own conclusions weakens. The mind wants the path as an object so it can feel safe. Yet safety is not the same as truth. So the reflective question sharpens. If you can explain the path perfectly, why do you still need the explanation to feel steady? At a certain stage, the question changes. It is no longer, how do I get peace? It becomes, who is the one who needs peace? You begin to inspect the seeker. This is not metaphysics. It is epistemic honesty. When the mind seeks peace, it seeks it for someone. That someone is a self-image that requires coherence. I must be right. I must be secure. I must not be exposed. I must not be uncertain. These requirements shape what counts as acceptable truth. Al-Ghazali's method, applied here, asks you to locate the motive. When you demand certainty, what are you protecting? When you avoid doubt, what identity feels threatened? When you rush to a conclusion, what discomfort are you trying not to carry for even a moment? Second-person introspection makes it direct. You see that the seeker self is not neutral. It selects knowledge that preserves itself. It resists knowledge that dissolves its dominance. It calls resistance reason. This is not a moral accusation. It is an operational description. Third-person exposition clarifies the core problem. The self wants peace as an achievement because achievements can be owned. But the more you treat peace as an owned state, the more the self must maintain it, defend it, and fear its loss. So the pursuit recreates the instability it tries to end. Now the paradox becomes unavoidable. If the self is the seeker, and the self is also what disturbs, can the self be both the disease and the cure? Al-Ghazali is often misunderstood here. The point is not to insult intellect. It is to keep intellect within its proper function. Reason can map. It can critique. It can refine. But it cannot manufacture final certainty as a state of the soul. When it tries, it becomes self-referential. It argues in circles trying to produce what is not produced by argument. You see this inside yourself when you use thinking as a direct treatment for inner instability. You say, if I just understand more, I will stop feeling uncertain. But understanding more often reveals more complexity, not less. So the mind becomes tired, not because reasoning is bad, but because it is being assigned a task it cannot complete. Third-person exposition states it cleanly. Reason can tell you what follows from what. It cannot guarantee that what you want to follow is what reality will allow. It cannot turn life into a closed system. When you demand closure, you are not using reason. You are using reason as a servant to desire. Second-person integration closes the loop. You do not stop thinking. You stop expecting thinking to be your final resting place. You let reason do what it does best, clarify, not coronate. So the reflective question stands. If reason cannot deliver final certainty, how can reason rationally accept its own limit without becoming irrational? This is the turning point. You stop adding methods and start examining the impulse behind methods. You notice the moment the mind reaches for reassurance. You notice it not as an order, but as an event. This shift is small but decisive. It changes the relationship between awareness and thought. Al-Ghazali's influence appears here as disciplined inward honesty. You do not force silence. You do not fight the mind. You simply remove the assumption that every question must be concluded immediately. You remove false urgency. You allow uncertainty to exist without treating it as a failure. Second-person introspection makes the pivot concrete. When a problem arises, the old mind says, "Solve it now or you cannot be at peace." The newer clarity says, "I can still solve, but I do not need solving to justify my stability." Solving becomes a practical act, not a metaphysical rescue. Third-person exposition names what is happening. The mind is learning to observe its own seeking as a conditioned habit rather than as a command that must be obeyed. The seeking loses some authority. And as it loses authority, the mind becomes less frantic. Not because it got what it wanted, but because it stopped believing it must want it in that way. So the paradox remains open. If you stop seeking peace, does peace arrive? Or do you simply stop measuring the absence of it? Now a mature definition appears. Peace is not a reward. It is what remains when distortion decreases. Distortion here is not only wrong ideas. It is compulsive certainty-making. It is the mind's habit of reshaping reality to protect its preferred self-image.
In third-person terms, this aligns with Al-Ghazali's deeper project, refine the knower. Not to remove intellect, but to remove the impurities that make intellect serve desire. When distortion decreases, perception becomes cleaner. You still face complexity, but you do not add unnecessary conflict by demanding that complexity become simple. In second-person terms, you experience this as a shift in inner posture. You think, plan, and act without turning conclusions into sedatives. You do not require that reality agree with your need for closure. You allow what is true to be true, even when it is incomplete. You allow some questions to remain open without calling yourself lost. This is not passivity. It is precision. You act on what is sufficient for action, and you refrain from pretending it is final knowledge. This distinction reduces the mind's tendency to inflate decisions into identity. So a final practical question remains. If peace is non-interference, how do you act in the world decisively without returning to the old need for certainty? At the end, the mind recognizes its category mistake. It chased peace as an object, as if peace could be possessed. But peace was never an object. It was the mind's relationship to its own movement. Al-Ghazali's deeper gift is not a final statement. It is a reorientation. Reason remains active, but it no longer claims sovereignty over what it cannot contain. You still inquire, but inquiry is not desperation. You still decide, but decisions are not proofs of ultimate control. What remains is a quiet clarity, knowing without ownership, thought without compulsion, certainty without collapse. And the last question stays unforced. If the highest clarity cannot be grasped, what exactly in you insists on grasping it?